Knights and Castles by Rachel Firth. Knights lived hundreds of years ago. They were special because they fought on horses. They could move around quickly in a fight. Knights fought with swords and long sticks called lances. They also used daggers and heavy clubs called maces. Knights used daggers if they lost their swords. Knights wore metal clothes to protect themselves. Early helmet, a tunic made of chains called chainmail. Shield. Later, knights wore entire suits made of metal. Helmet, hole to see through, holes to breathe through. Metal gloves called gauntlets. Ankle protectors. Spurs. It took years to be a knight. At 7 years old, you were a page. You learned to fight. You helped to serve food. After a few years, you became a squire. You learned to use a lance. You helped to look after the horses. When a squire was older, he became a knight. The squire knelt down. A knight tapped him on his shoulders. Then he handed the squire a sword and spurs. And the squire was a knight. Sometimes squires were knighted before a battle. Knights were the most important fighters in a battle. Before the battle began, they lined up. Then the order was given. They were charged. Foot soldiers ran beside the knights. Sharpened sticks to hurt the horses. People thought knights should protect women. They had to be polite, fair, and brave at all times. Some knights were better at this than others. The most important knight of all was the king. After him came the lords. Top knight, the king. Important knights, the lords. Most lords owned extra strong homes called castles. Less important knights worked for a lord. They lived in his castle. A lord going into his castle. Ordinary knights. Castles came in all shapes and sizes. The first castles were made of wood and earth. A castle known as a motte and bailey castle. Bailey, enclosed area. Drawbridge. Motte or mound, hill. These burned easily, so lords built castles of stone. Drawbridge, safe tower called a keep, moat. Over time, lords built bigger and stronger castles. A castle had everything that a lord and his family might need. This castle has had some walls taken away so you can see inside. The blacksmiths, stables, the kitchen, guards keeping watch. Sometimes enemy knights tried to take over a castle. They used the tower to climb the walls. They fired huge rocks at the castle. They shot hundreds of arrows. They hooked ladders over the walls. They attacked the door with a battering ram. They dug a tunnel under the walls to make them fall down. But castles were very strong and hard to destroy, pushing knights off the ladders. Enemy knights still throwing stones. There were lots of ways to fight back. Dropping boiling water on the knights below. Fighting the attackers as they step off the wooden tower. Battering ram breaking through. Knights didn't just fight. They also loved grand feasts. They ate all sorts of things, even peacocks and swans. Knights liked to hunt in their spare time. They hunted animals for food and fur. They also liked to read and play board games. Sometimes, knights held fighting games called tournaments. They tried to knock each other off their horses. Knights could show off their fantastic fighting skills. Knights kept their helmets down in a fight. It was hard to tell who had won. So they had patterns or pictures on their shields to tell them apart. These pictures and patterns were called coats of arms. Every single coat of arms was different. Over time, people invented new weapons. Cannons could blast castles to pieces. Later on, armies began to use handguns. These were far more dangerous than swords, and shields were no help. Castles and knights were no longer useful. Many castles crumbled and fell into ruins. These days, you can visit the ruins and imagine what it was like to be a knight. Knight and castle facts. It could take 10 years for 2,000 workers to build a castle. Knights' horses cost a lot to buy and feed. Some squires never became knights because they didn't have enough money. During tournaments, knights sometimes held mock battles. When a knight was away fighting, his wife looked after the castle. Famous knights. Richard Firth, 1157 to 1199, was an English king. He fought in wars abroad. He was nicknamed Richard the Lionheart because he was so brave. Ulrich von Liechtenstein, 1200 to 1278, was an Australian knight who moved around Europe challenging other knights to fight with him. El Cid, 1043 to 1099, was a Spanish knight who rarely lost a battle. Jean de Bossecourt, 1366 to 1421, became a knight for France when he was just 16 years old. He fought against the English in the 100 Years' War. William Marshall, 1146 to 1219, an English knight, was famous for his skill at tournaments. He terrified his enemies on the battlefield too. Famous castles. The White Tower is part of the Tower of London. It was built by King William I after he invaded England in 1066. Coq de Vachevaliers is a castle in Syria, in the Middle East. It was built by a group of knights called the Hospitallers in 1031. At one time, 2,000 knights lived there. Schlien Castle was built in the early 11th century in Switzerland. It is made up of 100 different buildings. The Alhambra is a castle in southern Spain. Its name means Red Palace because it was built from red bricks. Malbork Castle is a German castle built by knights called the Teutonic Knights in around 1274. The end.